Thanks again for joining me here. We are going to be back in the Joseph story today, and we are going to be in Genesis chapter 40 talking about pits and waiting. And I want to start by sharing a little parable of the pit. It was a man who fell into a pit and he couldn't get out. And a sympathetic person saw him and said, I feel for you down there. An objective person happened along and said, it's logical that someone would fall down there. A Christian scientist came along and said, you only think that you're in the pit. A Red Sox fan said, I was in my pit for 86 years. An Oakland Raiders fan asked, is there room for Mark Davis in your pit? A Pharisee said, only bad people fall into pits. And a Buddhist not far behind said, karma. A news reporter asked, can I have an exclusive story about you and your pit? A fundamentalist said, you deserve your pit. The mom of the man who was in the pit said, if you had listened to me and married Esther Weinberger, you wouldn't be in that pit. A politician said, that pit is there because of my opponent, and I approve of this message. Dr. Phil said, you need to get real about your pit. Sigmund Freud said, you're in that pit because of your desire to return to your mother's womb. An evolutionist happened along and said, you're from the shallow end of the gene pool, destined to die in that pit before you produce any predisposed pit-falling offspring. Dr. Fauci came along and said, here's a mask in case someone else falls into your pit. An IRS man said, are you paying taxes on your pit? A county inspector asked, do you have a permit for that pit? An evasive person came along and talked to him, but avoided the subject of the pit altogether. A self-pitying person said, you haven't seen anything until you've seen my pit. An optimist said, things could be worse. A pessimist said, things will get worse. Well, Jesus, seeing the man, asked, do you want to get out of that pit? Now, I think most followers of Jesus would certainly say that Jesus has pulled us out of our eternal spiritual pit of sin and death, promised us a home in heaven, and I do hope you know that God is a God who sees our eternal dilemma and rescues us. The problem, however, is that sometimes it seems as if God sees us in some other kind of pit, not a pit of unforgiveness and separation from him, but some other sort of pit, like a failing relationship or an illness or debt. And he sees us in that sort of pit, but sometimes we think he kind of just sits on his hands, leaving us to stay in the pit. And we start to feel like that Red Sox fan, wondering if and when this curse is ever going to be lifted and we'll get out of this pit. In thinking about this, I feel like I need to bring up another particular pit because of recent events in our country here. And because it's a scab in our culture that just keeps getting scraped open. You know who is in a horrible pit today? Is the family of Ahmaud Arbery. Ahmaud was that young, unarmed black man who was jogging and deemed suspicious by two white men who then armed themselves and in their truck chased Ahmaud down as he continued on his run. And shortly after, Ahmaud was shot dead in the street. And you can read the details for yourself online, but from where I sit, the details look very troubling and they look like there's just a lot of racism going on there. And what's additionally troubling is that the 74-day delay in the arrest of these two men. And maybe it's just me, but I find it hard to imagine that if a young, unarmed white jogger was chased down by two armed black men and shot dead in the street, that it would take 74 days for them to be charged. Our culture is still struggling with racism. And because of that, there is a pit for pretty much every person of color in our culture. Because every day they wake up knowing that they fit the bill of someone who, for far too many people, looks suspicious. And so to those of you from my church family, to Kim Asar and Kay and Arya and Alex Ashaolu, to Passion Broussard and Kevin, to Yana and Sabia and Angel, to Joyce Carson, to Christelle Cox, to Nikki Dotson, to Ermini Dicus, to Riley English and Ellie and Riley Jr., to Mike, Adrian, and Trin, to Kristen McLeod, to Brian and Sharon Newton, to Lysandra Wilson, to my wife and even my boys. If I missed anybody, I apologize. And to those of you who are watching, who are people of color, I'm sorry that our history and our present even is littered with this pit. At times, I think in some ways the pit isn't as deep as it used to be, and I can, as we all can point to certain examples that would support that. But it certainly hasn't disappeared. And although there have been some wonderful Christians who fought against racism, I'm sorry that the Church Universal hasn't been better at listening to you and getting with you in the pit and trying to fill in that pit. And I believe we want to be better and do better, because pits like this are sinful and they injure people and they call for a response from the followers of Jesus. Pain, abandonment, unjust suffering, life in a pit can challenge you. It can mess you up. And pits come in all shapes and sizes. A child's pit could be an abusive parent, the belittling language that they might hear, the anger, maybe even the hitting. Your pit could be a disengaged or a manipulative or a punitive spouse. Your pit could be living on the butt end of some slander or some gossip. Maybe it's a learning disability or how you feel about your appearance. It can be a pit of debt and it seems like you're never going to get out from under it. And some pits, as we have said before, are of our own doing. Our choices create our pit. Sometimes pits are from our enemy, Satan, sometimes because of other people, and sometimes they are from God. But regardless of their origin, pits can make you feel like you want to give up. It can invite you to doubt the future, doubt God. It can make you callous. It can tempt you to give up on being a dreamer of God's dream. And isn't that understandable? I have no idea what my faith would be like if I had to endure what Joseph from our story in Genesis has had to endure over his last 11 years. In our story, he's about 28 now, and he's been a slave for 11 years and in prison for who knows how many of those 11 years. And Joseph's pit is not of his own digging, right? He's in prison because of a spiteful lie from Potiphar's wife. He lived by God's standards and he got burned for it. But right now in the story, Joseph is a slave in an Egyptian prison. And so we're going to pick up in the first verse of chapter 40 here. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. So we don't really know what these guys did to get sent to jail. Maybe the cupbearer served white wine with a steak, and it was a big no-no. But what we do know is that Joseph is serving them, and he is attending to their needs. And so we pick back up here at the second half of verse 4. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. And so he asked Pharaoh's officials, who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there's no one to interpret them." And then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So Joseph can see that they're upset, and he's going to try to help them out. Now remember, the last time Joseph did some dream interpretation, people didn't like it too much, and they ended up throwing him into a pit and then selling him as a slave to the Midianites, who took him down to Egypt. But he's decided he's going to have another go at it here and keep doing and using the gifts that God has given him. So starting in verse 9. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches, and as soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." So Joseph tells him, he says, "Hey man, your dream is a good dream. Everything's going to work out for you. You're going to be back beside the most powerful man in the empire in 3 days. And so when that happens, help me out, man." Joseph's not having a good time. He is in prison, and prison is awful. The word that Joseph used to describe his predicament, this jail that he is in, the word he uses is a pit. It's the exact same word used to describe the well that his brothers threw him into 11 years ago. Now, the second dream that Joseph interprets is really more like a nightmare. And so we pick up in verse 16. When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I had a dream too. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." Not a good dream, but Joseph tells him the truth anyway. So how does Joseph do in his accuracy? Verse 20. Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, And he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in the interpretation. This is not like any kind of birthday party that I've ever been to. The baker becomes a gruesome party decoration, but everything happened just like Joseph said it would. So the cupbearer must be amazed and grateful that his dream wasn't like the baker's dream. He got his job, and more importantly, he got to keep his head. And with all of this relief and gratefulness in the cupbearer, Joseph should be on the fast track to getting released, right? The very next verse, the last verse of chapter 40, says that the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. And you got to feel for Joseph, because he has continued to do what is right. He serves and continues to use his gifts, and he speaks God's word, and he gives glory to God for what he is able to interpret. And who knows how long he's been in prison praying for his own deliverance. And finally, it looks like his answer has come, because this cupbearer is back in good graces with the Pharaoh, and he's forgotten. He's abandoned again. And so what is next for Joseph? 2 more years of prison. Now we know that it's 2 years because we get to read the rest of the story. But for Joseph, he has no idea how long he's going to be in this pit. So what are some so whats for you and I? Here's number 1. If you're in a pit, you may have to wait. We don't like to wait much, do we? Especially when it comes to pits. I mean, we have a hard time waiting more than a couple of minutes for the fast food to get our burger out to us. But when it's a pit, we really don't want to wait. And we believe that God gives us strength to endure our pits, but getting out of them is a lot more desirable, right? That doesn't always happen, though. And sometimes even God tells us what he told Paul. He says, my grace is sufficient for you. Sometimes God's trying to form something in us while we're in that pit. In Psalm 40, in verse 1 and 2, David says, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he turned to me and he heard my cry, and he lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock, and he gave me a firm place to stand. Now we like verse 2 better than verse 1, right? David got lifted out of the pit. But when? After he had waited patiently on God. And David had to wait a long time to get delivered from King Saul. And because of his pits, I think David could talk with authority about trusting God. People who have endured a lot of pits, or some long-term pits, can develop a faith and a depth of trust that wouldn't be there apart from enduring those pits. We learn how to wait on God by waiting, and we learn to trust in a unique way by waiting. Secondly, you can choose your attitude in your pit. Viktor Frankl was a survivor of the horrible pit of a Nazi prison camp. And he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. I had to read that in college. And I remember one of the things that he said was that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Nobody can steal how you'll respond to your pit. You can't control whether or not people are going to treat you fairly, but you are in charge of your response. And that brings us to the third so what. How you wait in your pit matters. Joseph waits well in his pit, in his attitude, but also in his behavior. Joseph served even from his pit, and we can too. Joseph exercised his gifts even from his pit, and you and I can do that as well. To wait on God doesn't mean wait and do nothing. What you do while you're waiting is important. The Apostle Paul, he encountered all sorts of pits in his life, and a lot of them wound up being prisons. And as he was waiting on the Lord while he was in those pits, he talked to his jailers, to his fellow inmates about Jesus. He wrote some letters that have blessed millions of people. And in his pit, Joseph waits well, and God's going to bless him for that. And lastly, be grateful for people's help, but you have to put your hope in God. Joseph asked for help from the cupbearer, rightly so, but ultimately his hope has to be in God. Why? People fail and forget. You will fail and forget people. I fail and forget people. And that's not an endorsement to continue to do that or to make an excuse for that. It just is. It just happens. What if Joseph had his greatest hopes resting in his family, the ones who sold him into slavery? What if Joseph had his hopes for justice or fairness on the government? That doesn't seem to be a very good place given his situation. How about his friend, the victim who was in prison with him, the cupbearer? He forgot Joseph. And Joseph's learning to greater and greater depths the lessons of waiting and putting his hope in God. The psalmist says in Psalm 146, starting in verse 3, says, don't put your hope or your trust in princes, in mortal men who can't save. When their spirit departs, what do? They return to the ground. And on that very day, their plans come to nothing. Blessed is he whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord his God, the maker of heaven and earth, the sea, and everything in them. The Lord who remains faithful forever. So be grateful for people's help, but put your hope in God. So before we have the Lord's Supper together, I want to invite you to listen to another song about waiting. God bless you.